Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. Hey y'all, it's Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast. How's it going out there? I have been quarantining during this coronavirus situation, basically camping in the wilderness in southern New Mexico and mostly without Wi-Fi or cell phone service. And I really think that that's been a gift for me because I can see when I go into town or get access to Wi-Fi or cell that like a lot of people are really freaking stressed out right now with the coronavirus situation and the economy and just the massive changes that we're having to deal with right now because of this situation. I've been trying to avoid reading a lot of news and just focusing on my work and what I'm doing and sitting with the plants and praying for the whole situation and trying to remain calm in all of it. So I know that this episode's coming out alongside some other ones after I haven't put any out for like a month or so. It's just the situation of where I am and getting access to the Wi-Fi I need to be able to upload things and do things. So it's just taking a second to kind of process through a few episodes and the process that we go through to make this available for y'all has many steps. So I'm glad you're still listening, and I know a lot of people are stuck at home and can't go outside very much because you are in a city or you're in a situation where there's not really a good place to go, where there's no other people or it doesn't feel safe. So I hope that the podcast provides some relief and some inspiration for your time at home right now. And I've been hanging out a little bit with the herbalist Doug Simmons. He's someone that maybe I will ask to be on the podcast. I haven't yet, but he lived in the wilderness for many years, and the word wilderness is constantly deconstructed and talked about on this podcast, but in this instance, he basically lived out on the land with his burros or donkeys for, I don't know actually how many years, at least over 10 years, eating pretty much mostly wild foods. And his perspective on things, hanging out with him, he doesn't do that now. I mean, he does live off-grid in an adobe house, and he is still very much this amazing herbalist, and he's interfaced in the world now more, but I've been hanging out with him, and the little community where he lives is very much isolated in itself, so a lot of people are not really interacting with the outside world, and so we are able to kind of see each other some. He just has instilled in me and some other folks around like just this reminder that fear and panic are more contagious than the virus itself, and that if we see the world and the universe as something that's constantly out to get us, then we're going to perpetuate that reality. And I think he's like, nature works in mysterious ways, and the best we can do right now is to try to stay calm and collected and really reflect on what it all means in the bigger picture, and to not jump on this bandwagon of believing everything that's on the news. He's told some stories about traveling in South America at one point where there was some stuff on the news about what was happening where he was, and that wasn't what was actually happening. And I'm not going to get into a big thing about like not trusting the government, but there are a lot of reasons why we shouldn't totally trust everything we're hearing. And I don't directly speak about that kind of stuff all the time on the podcast, but in some sideways kinds of ways we like address potential reality of that in different conversations we have here. So it's always worth questioning what we're hearing, and obviously I feel like it's important for everyone to be aware and conscious right now and careful, and to remain steadfast in our carefulness, but to not be afraid of each other and not be afraid of this whole thing. I think that these changes are needed, like we haven't been living in a way that is really feeding the land and the earth, and this is just a pause in all of this. And I know it's really stressful for a lot of people to not be able to go to work and to not know what's happening next, but I'm just trying to trust in, even though it's uncomfortable right now, the next thing will be something new and different we've never experienced. And I hope a lot of people are planting seeds in gardens right now if you have access to seeds, or if you can still order seeds online. Any way you can. And I hope, if anything out of this, that more people plant gardens. That's all I'm going to say about it for the moment. Like, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings that are swirling around about it, and I'm just sometimes careful about really offering my opinion on here or perspective really directly, because I'm constantly listening and formulating what I really feel and think about it, and I don't want to sound kind of, I know that everyone's situation is different, and I don't want to tell people how they should feel, we're in the situation they're in. So it's okay to be feeling stressed out too, and I'm just trying to imbue a little bit of like what I'm grappling with here and trying to sit with. And I hope that's inspiring for you as well, to try to like think about those things and try to realize that the panic wave and the situation we're in, being in a globalized culture during a pandemic, is a pretty new thing. We've never experienced this kind of pandemic, which pandemics have happened historically, but we've never experienced a situation where we're able to connect while in isolation in the way that we can with social media. And so, social media is so fast paced and it's so quick, and our nervous systems are responding so quickly. It doesn't give anyone time to really sit with what's receiving. I feel like, for me too, like there's always new things constantly at every moment, and for me to be out in the woods right now or in the desert and to come every now and then, I have to make a specific effort to get internet or cell phone service. And when I'm in it, I just focus on what I need to do, look at a couple news headlines, check in with some friends and family, and then go back out and try to not ride the wave too hard. Like, I have had moments for sure. I'm just taking that as a gift right now, even though it's made it difficult to try to be as productive with the podcast or as poignant with it. Okay, I'll stop with that, and I'll go ahead and introduce the next person for the podcast so y'all can get ahead and listen to this conversation. I actually think this conversation is really important for the moment we're in right now. And I did this interview kind of at the beginning of when this whole coronavirus thing was starting to go down, and it didn't feel on the collective level as scary at that moment, but it was definitely on our minds when we were doing this interview. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast is a conversation with Kollibri terre Sonnenblume, and we recorded this in person in southern New Mexico, and Kollibri's living and writing near where I've been camping out and stuff, and so we have got to hang out a little bit. So according to Kollibri's website, which is moshka.com, and it'll be in the show notes, he is a writer, photographer, tree hugger, animal lover, and dissident, and his past experiences include being an urban bike farmer, an indie media activist, and music critic. Kollibri has written a couple books, and I've read, at this point, several of them, and one of them is called The Failures of Farming and the Necessity of Wildtending, and another is called Road Tripping at the End of the World. And Kollibri also co-wrote a zine called The Trouble of Invasive Plants with Nikki Hill, who's been on the podcast a couple times at this point. And if you haven't already downloaded the free PDF version of that zine to read their really well-researched work, it's on Kollibri's website, which, like I said before, is linked on the show notes for this episode. Also on Kollibri's website, he publishes a regular column where he writes these really amazing in-depth essays on politics and the land and plants and farming and all kinds of things, so I highly recommend reading his work. I'm really struck by my interactions with Kollibri in person and online through his writings online and his books, just his ability to bring together ideas and topics from what seem like totally different corners of the universe and putting them together and relating them together in something that feels really full and multifaceted and well researched and just with a lot of perspectives in mind. And I think that that's what makes his work really good and important and insightful and unique. And so in this conversation with Kollibri, we definitely go deep into some topics and kind of pull in that interdisciplinary approach, something that I really resonate with in my ways in the world as well. In this conversation with Kollibri, a few things we talk about: the pros and cons of permaculture. We definitely have a big conversation about the whole idea of permaculture, We speak on wildtending as not just using knowledge from the past, but adapting to a changing world. And wildtending is something we've talked about a little bit on the podcast already. We speak on some connections between patriarchy, organized religion, and slavery. We speak on the blurry line between gatherer-hunter lifeways and small-scale agriculture. And we say gatherer-hunter for a reason, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the podcast so you can listen to kind of hear why we say that. We speak a little bit on horticulture versus agriculture, some history of agriculture and the negative impacts of agriculture on health and in our culture. We speak about Kollibri's various books that I mentioned in the introduction earlier, and zines on farming, wild tending, invasive plants, and traveling. We talk about questioning Victorian ideas of gatherer-hunter culture and the transition to agriculture. Definitely a hot topic right now. Kollibri makes a really good case for questioning these ideas. We speak on Kollibri's interdisciplinary approach to writing and how that's an important thing for anyone to consider doing. We talk about practicing small-scale agriculture with the fragmented ecology and culture we have right now. So, his book, The Failures of Farming, is not necessarily saying that farming is all bad. It's just mainly talking about large-scale farming. So we talk a little bit about gardening on a small scale, which of course right now in the situation we're in seems like an important thing to be doing. It's spring, we have an opportunity, we can start planting seeds, and while we're stuck at home, grow food and not have to go to the grocery store as much. And lastly, we talk about what to expect from Kollibri's new podcast, which I believe is going to be called Voices for Nature and Peace, and it may be out by the time I get this out. And I'm really excited to hear his podcast. I know some of the folks that he has interviewed for the podcast, and it's going to be a next level to his writing projects for sure. Look out for that, and we'll have links to his website. And if the podcast is out by the time we launch this, we'll have a link to that as well in the show notes. Before we get into listening to this conversation with Kollibri, I just want to give a shout out to the Patreon that we have for this project and let y'all know that there's a lot of different tiers that you can choose to support this project monthly on Patreon. And some of those tiers include getting medicine from me, herbal medicine that I make in super small batches and very mindfully. So you can check that out too if you're interested in also receiving medicine from me. That's at the higher tiers. And it's really essential for me to continue doing this that I get funding. I don't have any grants written right now with something I was trying to do this winter, which I haven't had a chance to do, and I don't really have any sponsors, and I'm not sure how I even feel about doing that, and I'm keeping it super simple with Patreon right now, but every now and then someone graciously also gives me a little money towards the podcast through PayPal. So there's also a link in the show notes for that if you don't want to do a monthly thing on Patreon. Just putting that out there because I put a lot of energy and work into this and kind of make my whole life about this. And, any amount of support on there really, really helps. The collective support is just super helpful. So let's go ahead and get to this conversation with Kollibri. I know this has been a little bit of a longer intro, but I just thought I would speak to a few important things that seem relevant right now. And I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Kollibri. It was really intellectually stimulating for me and had me thinking about a lot of new things. And I've just been reading his books cover to cover while I've been camped at the river and in the desert. So enjoy this conversation and check out his new podcast. All right, happy listening, y'all. Burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn with the heat that will warm these places.
My name is Kollibri terre Sonnenblume, and that's Norwegian, French, and German for hummingbird, earth, and sunflower. That's my legal name. And I do a lot of writing and photography, and I'm starting a podcast soon. I have a blog where my writing appears, and my writing has also appeared on Counterpunch, resilience.org, and a few other websites. And I'm starting a podcast soon because I feel like the writing has a certain audience, but I want to expand that audience. And the podcasts are definitely a growing part of the media environment right now. Every year there's more listeners and more podcasts. Social media, interestingly, seems to have peaked, and some people say it's even begun to decline. So to get a message out, it seems like podcasts are the way to go.
It's pretty unfiltered podcast too in some ways. Like I've been reading about how like social media is controlled by these corporations, but there's something about podcasts that there's like a free media element to it right for now, where you can kind of say, I mean, within reason, within like, you're not talking about child pornography and promoting it or something like that. Within reason, you can really, the individual can like put stuff out there and people will listen or they won't, you know.
Right, because you set up the podcast and you set up an RSS feed and then you submit it to different places to be distributed, right? Like the iStore is a popular one, but then like Sketcher, all these other Stitcher,
Podbeam, right? Yeah, you can kind of sign up Spotify for all these different platforms, and we'll put it out there for you.
Right, but they're not actually vetting the content.
I don't think so, but I don't know. So maybe iTunes does. Maybe they go through and like, I don't know. It's very quick though. When you release it, it takes 10 minutes, and I don't know if there's someone on the other end that like makes sure you don't have, because it's up to you to rate it and everything too.
It's probably complaint driven.
Yeah, which I don't know. It's kind of cool, or maybe not. I don't know.
It seems like a good place to be right now. Yeah.
Maybe you could tell people what you write about, because you have a lot of things going on with your writings and your research, and a lot of things are intersecting, and I really like that about your work, at least what I've read and taken in so far. You come in from like a political place, like social politics place, environmental place, philosophical place. There's a lot of things coming together, and that's how I like to think about things sometimes too. So maybe you could kind of give me a little bit of an overview about some of the things that you write about in your blog, and you've put some books out, and then from there we can dive deeper into some of the topics. Right.
Well, a lot of my writing the last few years has been focused on it has been, I guess you could say, interdisciplinary. It's been approaching a subject from as many different points of view as possible, or from as many different disciplines as possible, and trying to bring them together. I think that there's this term siloing that people use now about how about siloing different topics, and I think that's something that increasingly happens online and in social media, where you get into this subject or that issue, and you just talk about that, but you don't talk about how it relates to other issues. You know, I've always had a interdisciplinary perspective, and my college education was also focused in an interdisciplinary way, so that helped to encourage that. I went through a special program at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. It does no longer exist there, but it was a program left over from the 60s called the Paracollege, and what you did was you made up your own major. You didn't get grades, you got evaluations instead, and then you had to bring together, in your senior year, you had to bring everything together in an oral presentation and different presentations besides that too for your professors. So for example, you had to say how your chosen mode of study related to science, to religion, to literature, etc., to music. They wanted you to bring it all together, you know. So that was a cool approach to help encourage that part of my brain, and I do try to bring that across in the writing too. A lot of the writing I've done the last couple of years has been based on the traveling that I've been doing, and so it'll be about, oh, here's this place like Northern California, for example. And what's happening there? Oh, well, there's a lot of cannabis growing that's happening there. Well, what's the history of this area? Oh, well, the history of this area is that this is just the latest wave of resource extraction that's going on in the area. Before that, there was trees, the timber. It was also the gold and other minerals, and all of this included was done in part. Or to do this in part, what they did was a genocide on the Indians there first. So to look at a particular place, you're bringing in together everything that's happening now, also the history, and especially in the Western United States, the history that involves Native Americans is not very far back at all. It's very recent, you know, 100 years, a little more than 100 years in some places, you know. I mean, there were still Indians being taken away to boarding schools as late as the 60s, I think, you know.
Insane. Yeah.
But I mean, California was, you know, barely settled by Europeans before 1849. That was the year of the gold rush, for example. So that's when a mass of people came in and started doing things. So yeah, most of my time in the last 5 years has been in California and Oregon, both the deserts of Southern California and then the Redwood area of Northern California, because I was working on cannabis farms for money a lot the last few years. And that industry is changing, and it's no longer the same. It's no longer a source of great employment in the way that it once was.
Mm-hmm. You write a lot about plants and ecology and seeing places, that you're moving through or living for periods of time in that lens, like what's growing here and why. It almost seems like you can't separate the history from looking at something in that way, especially when you're also looking at like how the humans interact with the land in the past. How are they interacting with it now, and how should we interact with it in the future? It's like, the more you learn about that, the more you can't not think about the history, because things are the way they are because of what has happened and what's happening now. And not enough people, I feel like, especially people who will maybe study plants, like I guess the siloing thing that you're describing, I'm not sure if I've heard of that before, but maybe is that the narrowing end of a thing and you only write about that thing? Is that what you mean?
The specialization, or I'm just thinking about this particular environmental issue.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about this identity issue, or I'm just thinking about imperialism or whatever, and I'm ignoring everything else.
Or someone's like just studying native plants of California or herbalism as a topic, and then those things aren't even considered, and all of that is the history, the dynamic relationships to all those things, the resource extraction. How did gold mining affect, the populations of lilies or something, like it's all connected. And I really appreciate, like, you have one book you've put out that's sort of speaking to your relationship to farming and how you've kind of changed your relationship to farming, and another one is documenting your travels, and it's influenced by your life before that, of course, but like your travels and how you're seeing those places and the way that they kind of open up and are dynamic in those ways. And I think that's a really cool thing that not a lot of people do. I feel like maybe there are more people that are doing that now that it's become more relevant. But
yeah, I'm glad you brought up the botany part. I forgot to mention that when I was talking about the other things, because the botany, that's been a big part of what I wanted to write about too, is the ecology in general, but then plants in particular. And I do try to bring in here's the scientific name for it, here's how that plant is, here's how there's that viewpoint of that plant, but then obviously what's the ethnobotanical part, what's how people related to that plant. That's obviously a hugely important part of that plant too. And insofar as siloing goes, like I have a friend on social media who's a botanist, and she's very well educated botanist, and she supports herself by going out and doing different surveys of plants in the desert, in particular the cactuses and all that. And so when it comes to plant ID and botany, she's stellar. She's really good at it. Like if you want a plant ID for something in the American Southwest, go to her. She'll like know what it is, right? And one day she was up near Big Bear in the San Bernardino Mountains and posting photos of things that she'd found there. And she found the plant's called, the genus of the plant is Lewisii, I think. And so it's this beautiful plant. It sends up a flower in the spring before sending out any leaves, or hardly any leaves. It's a gorgeous plant. And she put up these pictures of it. And I'm like, wow, that's a cool plant, And then later she put up a comment. Oh, I looked up the common name. Yeah, it's called bitterroot. And I'm like, oh, it's called bitterroot? I mean, I didn't say that to her, but I'm like, oh, so this is one of the most important food and medicine plants in the U.S. American West for indigenous people and cultures, and that just kind of went right over her head. You know what I mean? She had no idea. I'm like, oh, bitterroot. Oh, here, really? Oh, like
And San Bernardino Mountains.
Yeah, which is pretty far south, because we think of that as, like it's really common in like more in the Great Basin, right, or the Rockies even.
There's
too,
piñons
right?
there too that go that far over, right?
Yeah, there's a few down there.
Outlier.
Yeah. But I mean, these are the mountains right outside of Los Angeles. We don't think of it.
Yeah.
So it was surprising to find it there. So, but it was, and there's no offense to her. That's just not her specialty. But that's how she was. Siloing things. That oh, it's this thing, and had no idea. And I happened to be in the area at that time camping nearby in Joshua Tree, and so I went up to the place where she was. It's a botanical reserve up in the San Bernardino Mountains called the Pebble Plains, and it's an area where it's only a couple hundred acres, maybe it's less than a square mile, but it's its own particular ecosystem that's really unique. And there are species of plants that are found only there and nowhere else in the entire world, you know? So it's totally worth visiting, you know? And it's because of the geology of the area.
The fault line or something too.
It has to do with, they call it the Pebble Plains because it has something to do with the rocks there, how the rocks broke down, and then how the precipitation has affected those. And so it's this pebbly landscape. And then there's all these very tiny plants that grow there and very tiny flowers. They call them belly flowers because you have to get down on your belly to see them. And so there's all these plants there that are like, you know, 2 inches high, 1 inch tall. I mean, just incredible stuff. I actually did a whole blog post on those with photographs on my blog that you could look up. It's back quite a few years, but so I went there. I went there then like the next weekend, and I'm like, okay. She told me kind of what part of the trail to find it on. It's only a 1 mile trail. I think I could find it. So I went up and I'm like, okay, let me be attentive. And I walked and I walked and I suddenly I'm like, okay. I stopped. I started looking around either side of the path, and then I found it.
It's easy to miss Bitterroot if you don't.
Yeah.
It can be small and not assuming.
It's definitely. And this was like, 20 or 30 feet off of the path. But I did find it, in part because I was listening, for it too. I'm like, okay, let me, I know you're calling, because everyone's calling all the time. So let me. And so I was able to find it and got some amazing photographs. That was really, it's a really neat plant. But yeah, I did a book that was a book of photography called Photographic Love Letter to the Flora and Fauna of the Mojave Desert. So that was all about animals and plants that I'd met down there over the course of winters. And yeah, it's just a picture book. I've got a copy here for you to look at. But so that one was focusing on that. So that was more of a nature literacy, or a nature, I guess you'd call it nature literacy. So here's these habitats, and here's these animals and plants, and here's how they interact with each other, and and there's some amazing ways that animals and plants interact with each other, and
I like how your work is based off like heavy research into as much of like the data that's out there that is in existence, which sometimes is biased, which you also filter and like look at, but experience in the field too. And I appreciated that about you and Nikki's zine on invasive plants too, or rethinking invasive plants, just how in-depth the research was. We're like, okay, well, people just say this thing, but what is actually supporting that? When you actually look at it, you're like, this is interesting. Like, and then when you actually get out there and observe, like with the Russian olive, and it's inferior forage, but then when you get out there and you actually see like everything is eating it, how can it be, So I appreciate that about like how you're coming at things too, is like it's investigative, it's challenging academia, but also using academia and being in the field. So
right. Well, when it comes to the science on really any topic, but especially on some of these topics of natural history or ecology, there's what people think the science is, sort of the popular ideas of the science, and then there's where the science actually is, So like the idea, like in Failure of Farming and the Failures of Farming and the Necessity of Wildtending, that book that I wrote a lot in there about the transition between gatherer-hunter cultures and then agricultural cultures, which took place in the Mideast, for example, around 10,000 years ago. So one of the ideas that we have lots of ideas about what the gathering and hunting lifestyle is like. And I started saying gathering hunting, and I'm not the first person to do it, rather than hunter-gatherer, because more recent scholarship has shown that the gathering component of the diet was more important and dependable than the hunting part of the diet, So that's something that has not gotten out to the popular idea yet, we think, oh, cavemen, they're eating meat and nothing else and dragging women around by their hair to their caves and this and that, and like this is, of course, like not historically accurate at all. But this idea of man the hunter, well, that goes back to the Victorian age, so the late 1800s, and those scientists then who all had, deeply held, and unexamined prejudices that they were bringing to their work, and in a lot of cases, it's these Victorian ideas about the past that we still are holding on to.
That we've imposed and brought forth with us into the present.
Yeah. Because when you get into the scholarship of it and like, oh, well, what was that transition like from gathering, hunting to agriculture, and what were the effects, and was that positive or negative, the effects, et cetera, et cetera. Well, since the 60s, in science, in anthropology, and archaeology, in these studies, they've been like, oh, wow, that was kind of a bad idea in a lot of ways. Like there was a lot of ways in which human beings' lifestyle declined at that point. So that's over 50 years now that science has known that, but that still hasn't really gotten out to the mainstream. We're still going with this Victorian idea of like, man the hunter, and then but agriculture was great because that was progress, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, the switch to agriculture brought about declines in individual human health, and brought about cultural changes that were bad for people, and that of course was also bad for the environment. So there were at least these three ways you can frame it, these three ways in which the move to agriculture was bad. So in terms of individual human health, we've seen from the fossil record that people's bones aren't as strong now as they were beforehand. People have more teeth problems, more dental problems now than they did, beforehand. And at least at first, when the switch to agriculture first happened, people didn't live as long either. More women were dying in childbirth. I mean, from the viewpoint of human health, it was not the move to agriculture was not progress. That was one. It wasn't regression either, because we hadn't done that before. It was a step in the wrong direction. Also, previous to that, in the gathering and hunting societies, the societies were far more egalitarian than the agricultural societies were. With agriculture, at least in the Mideast, quickly came patriarchy as well. So, in gathering and hunting societies, women were gathering and planting lots of food and herbs. So they were providing food, they were providing medicine, and they were absolutely essential to what was going on. So there wasn't the same degradation of male on female that was going on, because it couldn't happen that way.
I think one of your articles, because I've sifted through those books, I haven't read them cover to cover, it was talking about like what shifted in gender roles and when moving from a hunter and gatherer or gathering hunting culture, but dominated culture to agricultural based culture, just the sedentariness shifts the way that, and we're just assuming men and women right now, but like people who play different gender roles,
right? The
way that shifted, it really shifted how many people were born and the quality of life that people had, and like the ways that women didn't go out as much to do the gathering when things shifted to an agricultural dominated society.
Right, because we went from a migratory movement-based lifestyle to a sedentary lifestyle, to where instead of being, we're in the mountains in the summertime and we're down in the valleys in the winter, or however it makes most sense, on the coasts in the summer, and then up in the hills in the winter, or whatever area it was, people would follow what made they would go where it made sense to be for the weather, and then they would go where it made sense to be for what plants were producing at that time of year, or where the migrations of animals were taking place. Oh, the salmon come in at this time of year. Okay, well, we're going to go set up camp on the rivers at that time of year. Oh, the acorns are coming in. Well, we're going to be in the hills at that time of year. Like, this is how it was, always moving around. And so then agriculture was, oh, we're just sitting in one place now, and we're going to try to make everything work, here, And so, yeah, everyone was moving around less then. And the style of labor that agriculture brought in was also more difficult and more trying on bodies, More injuries are seen in the fossils of humans, or the remains of humans after the agricultural transition, showing that they were having to to work harder, in ways that weren't good for their bodies. There were other differences too, in that women didn't have as many babies when gathering and hunting as they did post-agriculture. One, because breastfeeding tended to be happening for longer. I just read an article that came out the other day about this recent study where I believe they were looking at teeth and bones of ancient fossils, and were like estimating that gathering hunting cultures in this part of the world where the study was, I believe it was also it was in Asia somewhere, that breastfeeding was going on as late as age 6. So if that's happening, you're not having another baby during that time. You're having a baby 6 years, because I correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe you'll need to look this up, but there's something about when a woman is lactating,
you can't really get pregnant.
Right, she's not ovulating, right? Okay, so there's just that. You know what I mean? So if you're lactating for 6 years, that's a whole 6 years not having kids. Whereas, look at an agricultural society, and maybe the woman's having 5 or 6 children during that time, just one after the other. We've definitely seen cultures where that's happened. So the population, the human population, really began to grow much more rapidly, at that time too, which has had its own obviously bad effects.
There's a couple things that come up in my mind in this conversation. One being, why are scientists ignoring the evidence of agriculture actually being a bad thing, which in some ways is the obvious answer, because we're wanting to support what the reality that we see now, and justify it in some way, and say it's okay and it's good, and put our culture and humans at the top of some kind of evolutionary pinnacle. But also I'm curious about where the line actually is crossed between what is gatherer hunter lifestyle and what is agriculture. I think in one of your in your Wildtending, or your book on farming and Wildtending, you outline in there, and this is based off someone else's research too, I think, of the different kinds of agriculture that you can call agriculture. And I guess, getting more familiar with Wildtending, which you've done a lot, and I interviewed Nikki and Gabe about Wildtending on the podcast too. I wonder, what of this would you call agriculture and not too, collecting seeds and replanting them using digging sticks, would you call that agriculture? Or it's maybe not. Maybe that is still more gatherer hunter, I guess. Yeah, so that's kind of 2 questions in one, but
I think the big difference is the traveling versus the sedentary portion. That's, I think, one of the main differences between Wildtending, which is part of gathering hunting, and agriculture, is that with agriculture now you're in one place, so
you have to guard your crop and
right,
tend it. And
exactly, there's that. And then another difference would be the fact that gathering, hunting, and Wildtending can be described as a cooperative relationship with a habitat and an ecology, and agriculture is pretty much by definition dominating instead,
taking everything out and just planting corn.
Exactly.
Something like that.
And yeah, there's a blurry zone in there somewhere.
People planting corn sometimes within an ecology, maybe in
right.
a floodplain.
Right.
But maybe they stuck close to it for part of the year, and then they drifted, and then they just came back, and
right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. In the Southwest, there was definitely the U.S. here. There was definitely cultures like that where the Hopi who were planting Three Sisters stuff, and yet that was also, there were still differences between that and what we see now. I mean, there's a difference between planting the corn, the beans, and the squash together in areas and flood irrigating them every once in a while than the literally hundreds of thousands of acres of corn genetically modified growing in the Midwest now. I mean, definitely there's some place where one leaves off and the other starts. Also, some other distinctions that people have made too is that you could talk about horticulture and agriculture. And horticulture is maybe what we think of as gardening, right? So if you have a garden that's a horticultural endeavor, not an agricultural endeavor, right? And a horticultural tool back in the old days would have been the digging stick, you know? So the same digging stick that would have been used for digging up roots before and poking holes in the soil and putting in seeds and then going on your way and coming back to that same place later, that same stick then got used when people first became sedentary. So they were still using that, but now they're using that to plant in one place. So that would still be horticulture, some people would say. And then agriculture began when they brought in the plow. Mm. So the plow was something that a human being was steering, but was being pulled by an animal. So now we've got domestication of an animal going on, and animal domestication was absent from wildtending. You were working with your environment in a way that was affecting the animals, and in some ways it was making it better for them, or etc. You know, like if you're doing a low level controlled burns in an area that are keeping it from the forest from taking an area over and keeping it to where berry bushes are always, there. Well, bears love that, obviously, other, game animals, as they say, will like these areas. So there's where you're doing something that's actually a benefit to certain animals.
But it's not dominating over the animal. You're just working with.
Domestication is not good for animals. It just isn't. Anyone who wants to make I don't know if I even hear people make that claim. I don't know if anyone would be that silly, but one thing that happens with domesticated animals over time is that their brains shrink, I mean, other changes to their bodies happen so that they're not as well suited to be able to survive on their own. Domestication's not a healthy thing for a species. And in a sense, that's what agriculture was about us inventing domestication and domesticating ourselves, domesticating animals, domesticating plants, basically trying to domesticate entire landscapes and everything in them, And the fact that agriculture led to that and led to these declines in human health and these negative things in human culture, that's not really a point of controversy within science, Within popular ideas about things, it's a controversy. But the question since the 60s, has basically been, okay, yeah, we know this was a wrong turn. Why? And there's not an answer to that question, so don't ask me. There's different. we don't know exactly how it happened.
It happened in different places at the same time, or generally around the same.
It happened first in the Middle East, and then it happened a little bit later in China, and then it happened a little bit later in the Americas, and it never happened in Australia, for example. There they were doing wildtending and they were doing burns and they were doing that kind of thing, but they never switched to agriculture there, which is pretty fascinating because humans have been in Australia for conservatively 40,000 years, but some people say up to 125,000 years,
Wow.
And agriculture in the Americas didn't get taken up until, in North America, I think it wasn't until something like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, so it was fairly recent. The Middle East is the first place we know about it, where it happened. So like the area that's now Iran, Iraq, the Fertile Crescent, sometimes called the Levant, that area, there's where it started. Like its roots started like 10,500, 11,000 years ago. There was different climatic changes that were happening at that time. Like we were coming out of an ice age. Then there was a period called the Younger Dryas where it got colder again for like 800 or 900 years. Then it started getting warmer again. That was a period of time there that seems somehow key to the transition in that area. Definitely foods that would have been available before wouldn't have been as available as the climate changed, because it changed rather rapidly towards cold. And even that's not known what caused that. This like temporary recolding period, and we're not sure. Was it a volcano? Was it, comets? We're not even sure about that. But something happened to make the climate colder, so we almost started to go back into an ice age again, and then came back out of it. And that period, the Younger Dryas, that of course, that's also well established. Everyone knows that happened. That, we don't know why. But these different, it was right around then and right immediately after that the agricultural transition took place. One theory as to partly how that happened is that in times of sudden stress, perennial plants can respond by mutating into annual versions of themselves, because annuals are better able to deal with rapid changes because you're making seed every year.
Like self-seeding annual, just like put it out there now. And...
yeah. Okay. Boom. Here it is. Here's my chance at genetic combinations that'll work right now. And I'll do it again next year. I'll do it again next year. Like to just try to keep up, you know. And so that's it's believed that perennials is that's the default mode of plants, is to be perennial, and that annuals form as an exception, sometimes repeatedly in the same family, you know, when there's stressful events that happened. So that would have been how we got annual wheat plants all of a sudden. So because the plants that were important to moving to agriculture were like emmer wheat, and I can't remember the name of them, but there's several different kinds of wheat that were perennials that became annuals at that point, that we started eating. Flax was one of the first crops at that point, you know. So that climate shift helped change the plants. So that change in plants, maybe that's why we started to do it too. But we still don't fully understand why it happened. We just know that there's been a decline in many aspects of quality of life, you could say, since then.
In some ways, agriculture gives you this maybe false sense of security. Well, if I can watch over this thing and have more control over these plants, I'll have this certain amount of food guaranteed. But in fact, at times it's the opposite, where you suddenly become reliant totally on it working out perfectly every year, and then suddenly you have a famine because something in nature like affects your crop, you know. And so it ultimately ends up having an opposite effect, where like it isn't really very food secure, even though maybe your original intentions were to have a little more control over like how much food we're able to get and store, you know, for times where there might not be, you know. Yeah.
But what you're describing there is kind of a scarcity mindset, right? But the scarcity mindset is itself a product of agriculture, because agriculture brought in a time where now we did have like sudden cycles of abundance and then scarcity. So the first couple thousand years of agriculture in the Mideast are definitely marked by famines, where the whole system would collapse. Whole societies would collapse.
And then it would rise up again and try again.
And then they'd try again. And in some parts of the world, people walked away from agriculture and didn't come back to it again. And in other places, they kept trying it over and over again. But part of the problem with trying to understand that time and why it was that we switched from one mode to another is that our minds are so domesticated, are so part of that mindset at this point, that it's hard to think about it without projecting our own ideas back there.
I was about to say that, because we often, as well, I think I see people romanticize back then. It was perfect. It was like this. We can possibly assume what the motives are, what the motives of people were, and like what society was like. But ultimately, we only have archaeological evidence to go from, and the cultural bias that we have now. Like, even if we say that we don't have a cultural bias, we do, you know.
Well, we have the archaeological evidence, and then we have looking at non-agricultural societies which have survived to the current day, or to recently, that were studied. So a lot of the non-agricultural societies in the Western United States were actually observed, studied, take notes upon before they were wrecked or partially wrecked, or et cetera. So some of these things, some of these observations were made, so we know a little bit about, here's what their structure, what their family structure was like, here's what their diet was like. So we know some of that from firsthand. And then there is still a handful of cultures, it's in the lower single-digit percentage in the world, human cultures who are still gathering and hunting, you know. A lot of them are in the Amazon, for example, but some of them are also in Africa, some of them are also in Asia. And here in the United States, especially in the Western United States, there are some people who are some Native people and friends and allies of Native people who are trying to bring it back, because it's not all gone yet, you know. Like Like there were some things that got remembered, some things that got handed down. So there's a line of connection between now and the past here in the Western United States with the indigenous cultures here that is frayed but not broken.
Not totally gone.
Yeah.
And we still don't know. I mean, even I'm also careful to think about like the anthropological field, and it historically has also been problematic of white men studying brown people, basically, you know, and and there's stuff in that too that you don't really still know what people's lives were totally like. And that's not the only format we have indigenous knowledge like carried to us now, but that is one of the books. A lot of the books that are out or come from that format, you know, and we can still glean something from that that's important, but also like acknowledge that part of it, you know, and the cultures that are being noted and studied were under certain pressures. I don't know if you mentioned that in one of your pieces too, like it's still like acknowledging that they were under colonial settler right. colonial pressure in the midst of all that, trying to hold on to these lifeways. But
yeah, because if you go to Africa, for example, and look at some of the gathering hunting cultures that are there, or Australia, for example, these are two examples where people talk about that. Yes, they're still there. Yes, they're still trying to do it. But yeah, it's not on the land that they originally had. It's not with the mix of animals and plants that were once there. It is with these outside pressures constantly trying to get them to change. And so what one author who I quoted in the book was talking about, well, we're actually seeing them at their worst in some way, and it's impressive at how well they're still doing considering that.
Yeah. Well, you were a farmer in Portland for a while, and so your book, The Failures of Farming and the Necessity of Wildtending, documents some of that. And I guess, what do you think about small-scale farming in our current times, and permaculture, which is this interesting farming / perennial tending, some agriculture, some wild tending stuff? I don't know. Like, what do you think about those things? Because it seems like in that book, maybe you have had a journey with all of that, and like maybe you have some conclusions now what you think about it. But I'm just curious.
Right. Well, there's a like a kind of a parable like story, very very short, that I think helps make sense of these situations. And I'm trying to remember I can't remember the author's name, but I quote him in one of these books. But he talks about how, let's imagine that there's a little forest, and there's birds living in the forest, and then some people come along and they cut down the forest and they build a barn, among other things, right? So now the birds don't have anywhere to make their nest anymore if they want a tree. So they go make their nest in the barn, right? And the author of this little parable talks about, well, we don't call the birds sellouts, for one thing. Only humans are that silly, and that's certainly true. And it also just points to the reality of the time that we live in, is that we can't just live the way that we did before, because everything is so different now. There are all these different pressures. Everything has been, the whole landscape's been very fragmented, I mean, right now we're talking, and we're in the Gila River Valley in southwestern New Mexico, and we're next to some irrigated pastures for cows, but that would not have been irrigated pasture 200 years ago. That would have been wetlands with, meandering streams in it, not channelized irrigation ditches like we have now. And there would have been native foods in there. There would have been a lot more animals of all kinds. I mean, you would have been able to just live here for part of the year off of the bounty that was naturally producing itself. Now, well, no, not so much. I can't just be like, oh, I'm going to live off of the land here.
Well, it's privately owned by a mining company, right?
It is. You know what I mean? And so
first off, private land ownership.
Yeah, and and maybe in this valley, I've heard it's socially acceptable actually to walk across across a lot of these pastures to other parts of the valley. They're low key about that, But if I went out there and tried to plant some things or whatever, they might feel differently about that, right? So all that being said, we're living in this time where of course to eat and to survive, we need to just take advantage of whatever it is that we can. So on this property, I'm doing a lot of gardens now, and I was an actual farmer at one time, so doing gardens is not so difficult because it's much smaller scale than what I was doing before, But so certainly because in the background of all this, of course, we have a rapidly changing world. The climate is changing. The United States is changing. It's an empire in decline. Things are starting to fall apart here. Economically, things are falling apart. Culturally, things are falling apart. Like we've seen this story over and over again in history. Empire goes down. Things become more polarized. That kind of scene happens, right? So in that kind of scene, well, we just need to do what we need to do to get by. And that's going to include, gardening. It's going to include small scale farming. It's going to include permaculture. It's going to include whatever people need to do, as we also try to relearn the older ways of doing things. And those will look different now too, of course, because now there's different plants that are here, and there's plants that weren't here before, So obviously wild tending would now look different. It's not going to look exactly as it did before. I mean, now that like here in New Mexico, I think that half of the forests here burned down a couple of years back, of the national forests. And with the changing climate, it could be that, well, we know actually that the forests aren't going back the same way they did before. Now different species are growing in different places, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a changing world. We're stuck in the barn. We don't have the forest. Maybe the forest is going to go back at some point, but in the meantime, we're stuck in the barn. So even though, so knowing that, we can then look at our own efforts and be like, okay, I'm going to be farming here, for my friends and my neighbors, with my friends and my neighbors, so we can feed ourselves. Let's just be cognizant together of what this relationship is like. How is it that we're interacting with the other plants and the other animals here as we're doing this? How is it that we can do what we need to do to feed ourselves and yet not also take on a domineering way of looking at things that is bad for the dominator as it is for the dominated? The person who is on top of the dominating game is not a happy or a healthy person either. Like, you don't want to be in either position. You don't want to be either the dominator or the dominated. So how can we, being that agriculture is sort of inherently dominating, how do we practice that in such a way that we're trying to make it as least dominating as possible? Those are the questions we would just need to ask ourselves as we're going about, doing things. So permaculture, there's a lot of people who are attracted to permaculture and who are trying to practice it are very good-hearted people, and they have very good intentions. And I have known many of them and been friends with many of them over the course of my life and farming and this and that. I'm personally a little bit skeptical of the permaculture idea because I feel like there's a lot of unacknowledged appropriation that's going on in it, and that there's
of indigenous knowledge.
Indigenous and just other methods that aren't even indigenous, but they're just other places, and sort of bringing them together. Oh, look, this, and they knowingly, the inventors were or the founders of permaculture were a couple of Australian guys, I guess, and they were knowingly being like, okay, let's look at the world of agriculture as a buffet, and let's pick a bunch of things out. Let's put it together. I mean, they knew they were drawing from other sources, and there's nothing wrong with obviously with seeing a good idea someplace and then trying to implement it, but not in all cases does an idea from somewhere else apply in a different place. You can't just take, okay, maybe making that special soil in the Amazon, terra prieta or whatever it's called, with the charring things. I'm sure that's a good idea there because it's very prevalent there. That might not work here in New Mexico. That might not work in Oregon. That might not work in New York State. That might not. It just might not.
Swales don't work everywhere either.
No, and so you can't just pick an idea, from anywhere. The permaculture people like to point to an amazing Japanese farmer, Fukuoka, who you might have heard. He wrote One Straw Revolution, and he had a way of breaking agriculture down so that it wasn't just about wiping everything away. He was planting in amongst the weeds. He was letting the weeds grow there too. He was not pruning his fruit trees. He was doing some really interesting things, and he was getting amazing yields. It was really working very well for him. Over and over again in the book, he says, I'm not trying to create a method. I'm just telling you what worked for me, and I'm telling you that you need to approach your own piece of land, and you need to look at it for what it is. He wasn't trying to create a method. And the permaculture people look at him and go, look at the great method, let's apply it. And every time I see this happen, I'm like, have you read the book? and you obviously don't respect it. It's
coming from the spiritual philosophical place of approaching land where it's at and how you can be integrated in it, not still imposing methodology onto a place, right?
Yeah, and there was a lot of Buddhism in it too, and we don't understand Buddhism here in the West, And so there was a whole cultural background to Fukuoka and what he was turning away from and what he was drawing on, all that, none of which we understand, here. And to read him and to be like, I see, he's just talking about how to approach life, Okay, great. I can take that spirit, I can take that idea, and I can apply that in my own endeavors, including my farming, but I shouldn't be trying to imitate what he's doing because I'm not trying to grow rice, I'm not trying to grow rice in Japan, I'm not in Japan, I'm not trying to grow rice, and I'm not Japanese. So there's a aspect of permaculture that is also very focused on design, and that as well, I have some I have some skepticism for as I've seen it applied. So there's a little bit too much of the graph paper mentality of like, oh, here's our property that we've got here. Okay, we're gonna draw it on a map here what we want to do. Okay, now we're gonna go put that on the landscape. There's a lot of that goes on, you know. And there's also permaculture people who are more thoughtful than that, who aren't doing that, you know. But there's permaculture doesn't, in my mind, doesn't go far enough to break from our bad habits and our bad ways of thinking, you know. It's just sort of trying to put another method in there for another, you know. And of course there's permaculture the ideal, there's permaculture as it's practiced, you know. And when I was in Oregon, one of the things that permaculture people were always doing was mulching their gardens really heavy, you know, bringing in straw, leaves, whatever it was, mulching it really heavy, because that's one of the things that's often done in permaculture places. Well, the trouble is that something like that works really well in the Midwest. Something like that works well in the American South, on the East Coast, etc.
Rain all the time.
Right, yeah. and where you have hard freezes, yes. You know. And in Oregon and in west of the Cascades, there, sort of the Pacific Northwest, what you do when you put a heavy mulch on the ground in an area that doesn't have that many hard freezes every year is you make the perfect habitat for slugs, right? Slugs aren't really a problem in like Nebraska, where I grew up. I don't think slugs are really a problem in New England. I mean, were slugs a problem where you were from?
The only time, well, I farmed in New England and in the South, and the only time slugs were a problem in New England is when we left too much of our like brassica refuge in the garden.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah.
There would be moments when we would do certain things that would increase them coming, but not like, I don't know what it would be like in Oregon.
Right. Well, the slugs are a very common agricultural pest in the Pacific Northwest. They love it there. It's like just the perfect. And the ones that are problems in the gardens are actually not even native slugs. They're slugs that came in, you know, with the Europeans somehow. I don't even know how that happened, but that's how it went down. And so
on the backpack.
I don't even know, right? And so there's even a rumor that they're the same slugs as escargot snails, but I don't know if that's true. But anyway, so they might have been brought in for that. So there they were. So every spring, this is like 10, 15 years ago when I was farming there, I was on the permaculture listserv. So this is before social media. People had the list, you know, you'd subscribe to an email list and lots of people are on it. You send out a message, everyone can read it. There's discussions that happen, you know, basically the same dynamic was there, you know, of people disagreeing with each other needlessly and etc. But and some information being good that's coming through it. So that was there. And every single spring on the permaculture list in Portland, oh my gosh, what do I do about my slugs? Oh, I'm having so much trouble with my slugs. Oh, they're eating everything. It's like, well, that's because you have freaking slug habitat throughout your entire garden. You know, okay, if you want to mulch your garden over the wintertime to protect it from the cold, okay, fine, do that. But then in the spring, when it's time to plant, you need to get that stuff out of there. You need to rake every bit out of there. You actually need bare ground, you know, to plant your little starts in amongst, you know, so that and then you can put diatomaceous earth on them or around them or whatever to keep the slugs out. Whatever it is you want to do, beer traps, it's fine. But if you are planting your plants in the mulch, you're planting them in the slug's home. They love it. There they go. They're going to eat your sweet plant. Like, duh, you know? And so much better than mulching a garden bed over the wintertime in the Pacific Northwest was to plant a cover crop there over the wintertime. That was not slug habitat, or only a few would live there. So if you planted a cover crop of, say, oats mixed with field peas, mixed with fabas or something like this, you know, a grass is a good one because it sequesters carbon, sequesters nitrogen. You know, the legumes are good is because they get the nitrogen from the atmosphere and they capture it, you know. And so you're bringing minerals into the soil, elements into the soil, and you're holding them there. And I remember one year we had this garden plot where we had it divided exactly in half, and one half we did this heavy cover crop on, and the other half we did not. We cleared the whole bed in the spring. We planted the same crop across both of them, and it was broccoli, I think. It was something that the slugs love, you know? And the slugs on the side that hadn't had the cover crop on it just got hammered. You know, it was something like a 75 to 80% attrition rate. And then right next to it, like inches away, in the other half of the bed where the cover crop had been, it was like the opposite, basically. It was like a 10 or 15% attrition rate. And it was just very clear. It was like, oh, well, here's what you need to do here,
Know the place where you are and what you're doing,
Which is actually the very first part of permaculture is observe. That's the very first part is observe, not follow the directions of what someone else is doing and just hope that it works. No, it's observe, And so this is what I didn't see. What I didn't see very
playing
much.
Out.
Yeah, in the circles.
I did a training last spring at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center in California, and I've farmed for years. I've lived in the wilderness. I've had a lot of different lifestyles that engage with gardening or farming in some way. My dad's a horticulturalist, and I was always around nursery stuff, too. But I was like, okay, it's finally time for me to do a permaculture training. I just want to see what the deal is, I've taken care of other people's abandoned installations on farms.
Right.
I've lived in places where people had permaculture stuff going on, and they're doing these different things, and I wanted to understand more of what that was all about. And I think the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center does a pretty good job of really headlining, kind of thinking more about indigenous land and being more integrated into the environment, although it was very California specific, which, there were some folks from the South who were in the training who were like, I'm not sure how this part's going to really integrate into what we're going to do there. So in some ways they were making it very location specific. Right. But in other ways, I think it was interesting too. We were working with the Cultural Conservancy, which is a native run organization, basically. I'm not sure exactly what they would define their goals as being, but they do stuff they do Wildtending type stuff. They do a lot of cultural revitalization work in the Northern California. It's intertribal, but they had a piece of land that someone had given them, and they wanted to see what people's ideas were for this piece of land. And there wasn't a lot of classes on TEK or traditional ecological knowledge or Wildtending specifically within the permaculture training, but I think ultimately they were wanting something that was really culturally sensitive or culturally relevant to native folks, and that's not necessarily usually part of permaculture trainings to even think about that.
No, it's not.
So most people's designs weren't really ultimately considering that. They had these elaborate labyrinths and well, let's move all the land over to this side, and then we'll put this crazy orchard over here, and and I think, not to knock those people's designs, they were beautiful, really, it was interesting what people came up with, but I remember in my group I kept being like, well, why don't we put basketry willow in, and they wanted these things, Osea dogwood, and how about this is all wet, this is perfect place for camas, and no, people weren't really thinking of those things first because they're not permaculture plants or whatever. They're not really usually considered. And ultimately, when we presented our designs, they really appreciated the more minimal designs that were let's plant a few oaks, put some basketry plants in, some space for people to grow their corn, sacred corn, a seed collecting station, and they actually the minimal, more I don't know, the less space for observation, more over time. What does the land actually want from that place that will be in line with their cultural desires, their desires to connect to the land in a cultural way. So yeah, it was interesting. And then realizing that a lot of permaculture is about these grandiose designs, which work in some places, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want to slam on the people who are into it, because a lot of them are very well-meaning people, totally. And they're just really trying as hard, and they do care, and they love plants, and they want to help people, and they want community, and so I
don't want to slam on it either.
No, but at the same time, it's the approach itself definitely has had, some significant problems.
And maybe it'll shift and evolve as people start to realize what works in certain places and what's a way for it to make sense, I really appreciate here, y'all are small scale gardening, but you're also integrating your Wildtending stuff. Nikki has her cloning going on, some elderberry twigs and camas bulbs that need to be transplanted, and so using these tools that you have to do small scale gardening to also do Wildtending work.
On this piece of property here, there's a lot of mesquite trees that are growing here. And the mesquite pods that they produce, it looks like a bean pod. The mesquite pods it produces were one of the staple crops here. So like last year, I made a big effort. Once I saw that they were coming in and they were getting ready, they dry out on the tree when they're ready. I made a big effort to collect as many as I could. And so I was going out every 3 days or so, another set would be ready to harvest, you know. And I gathered a whole lot of them, you know. And I'm lucky that there's a grain grinder here, a mill that can be used to break them down, because that's what you do is you make them into a flour and then you work with them from there. So that I did, and I collected a lot of some of the pods that I collected. I didn't realize you needed to not pick the ones that had particular coloration on them, because that might be mold. So now I'm considering those to be for seed, of course, you know. So I'll be looking for some place to plant those, you know. And of course I'm just a mile from National Forest here, you know, and so there's prickly pear cactus up there that are going to be making fruit, and there's pinyon pines in the area, you know. So I mean, I'll see how I can get into. So many little things. Yeah, I mean, I'll see what I can do. You know?
I was reading in one of Michael Moore's books. He's deceased now, but he was an herbalist that wrote.
I know him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was reading actually this morning about mesquite in one of his books, and he actually said that their range has increased because of grazing, because of perennial grasses being overgrazed. That mesquites are like way further in their ranges. They don't really probably need any kind of planting, because they grow way more and further than they did before, because some relationship with the overgrazing and perennial grasses, and like it has encouraged the spread of mesquite. That's just something he mentioned in his Materia Medica on mesquite that I just noticed.
Interesting.
But you know, it's a wonderful tree that if it wants to increase in response to that, then I don't know. I mean, kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a place in the Mojave National Preserve which has a Joshua tree woodland in it, and it's the densest Joshua tree woodland in the world. And of course, Joshua trees are only in that part of the world. So, but that's in the Mojave Desert. They grow closer together there than anywhere else, you know. And so part of it has to do with soils and et cetera. But I guess part of it also has to do with grazing, that there was overgrazing in the area. It got rid of a lot of the smaller shrubs and the perennial grasses, which just made room for the Joshua trees, which weren't being grazed, were of no interest to the cattle at any life stage. So now there's more, and it's a really astounding area to go visit, because you don't usually see Joshua trees that close together. It's almost like a forest.
Wow.
There, yeah, it's definitely worth visiting.
I've seen them in the area, but I've never seen that. That sounds really cool.
Well, they're usually very, very far apart, you know, like they're scattered, you know what I mean? They're like 10, 20, 30, 40, you know, like sort of uniformly spaced over a large area. But here they're rather close to each other. Yeah, Sema Dome in the Mojave National Preserve.
Cool. Also, this reminds me, I had sent you a few questions ahead of time, and this was sort of part of what was on one of the questions. It just had me thinking about public land. I read your piece on basically the racist origins of a lot of our parks and public lands, and I've been reading about that in general lately after doing some residencies with Signal Fire, this sort of arts as activism organization that gets artists into wilderness areas to kind of like study that very thing of like, what does this mean that we're even able to be here, like, and why, how was this place even formed, like whose land, what native land are we on, and like what was the story behind that. And so I guess maybe would you like to speak to that a little bit, because it is an interesting reality too that we live in a world where like we have private land ownership and public land, and even the public land has a really dark history of how it was formed. I actually got kind of I was like pissed off reading some of those. I knew some of you basically kind of went through certain parks and like how they were formed, and like basically how the native folks got fucked over like every single time. And I knew like the Yosemite one, I knew some of that, but some other stuff like I was like, what? So I think a lot of people like hold up folks like John Muir, even though he was overtly racist. He even said it in some of his writings, like looking down upon the native folks that were in Yosemite, you know, and things like that. Miwok? Can't remember which group was in Yosemite. If I'm wrong about that, I'm sorry about that. But people uphold folks like John Muir as being these like heroes, and like the parks, and like that's all like good, you know. And I guess I don't know.
Well, it has to do with the idea of what is wilderness, right? That's
And
the,
what is wild?
what is wild. So they wanted, so the point of the national parks was at some point became to try to preserve wilderness. However, the idea of wilderness was that's what land is like without people on it, you know? And so that's the issue with all these national parks, you know, Yellowstone and Glacier. Those are ones I wrote about, and the Everglades, the one you just mentioned that's in the Sierra, Yosemite, yeah, and there was a couple others I talked about in that. So in all of those places, the landscapes were wild tended. They were the result of cooperation between people and the environment. There was either controlled burns, or there was planting, or there's various activities going on in each place, such that the landscape as the Europeans found it was not an unpeopled wild landscape in that sense. It was a landscape that existed because of the interactions with people. So then you take people out, say that people aren't allowed to do anything there, and now here it is, this wilderness. It's like, well, you're actually trying to create something that didn't actually exist, right?
It's a fantasy.
It is. It's fantasy. And if you're looking at, you know, really most of the ecosystems of North America have only existed in the state that they have now for like the last 12,000 years or something like that, since the receding of the last glaciation period, right? Because we're in the midst of an ice age. It's been going on for, you know, a couple million years now, or at least, and there's periods of less and more glaciation. We're in a period of less glaciation right now, right? And we would be expecting a period of more glaciation to be happening soon, except for the fact that we're artificially warming up the climate now. We're putting that off. But anyway, so any of these landscapes, you know, like you know, 15,000 years ago in Glacier, well, I don't know, that was under what, a mile of ice or something, probably, right? It was very like there were no trees or anything growing
what
there, right?
Are we actually romanticizing? Like, what are we?
Yeah, well, we're making something up because yeah, the Mojave Desert, you know, 15,000 years ago was lakes, you know what I mean? And like trees, and it was rainy, and like different set of animals lived there, you know, like even Florida would have been different, you know. Well, it would have been during the glaciation period, Florida would have been bigger, of course, because the ocean levels would have been lower. So any of these areas would have been much different. So they only came into the place where we now consider them to be their natural environments something like 12,000 years ago,
which always had humans involved for the most part.
And humans have been in on this continent, you know. The old number was 13,000 years. No one really believes that anymore. Everyone knows it's bigger than that. Everyone knows, you know, and some people, you know, say, oh, it's 30,000 years humans have been here, 50,000. Some people, again, say 125,000. I mean, it's been a long time. So in other words, the none of these landscapes were ever unpeopled, you know, once the ice, you know, receded and people could be there. There were people there. So by, you know, taking all of the Native Americans out of Yosemite, by not allowing them to live there, by not allowing them to tend the landscape there, you're now creating something that just didn't exist before. It's new. It's new, you know. And so there's something strangely misanthropic about that as well, you know, that like, oh, we've got to keep humans out because humans suck. Humans just destroy things. Well,
protect this land from
people.
Yeah.
Well, we humans, as in European culture based on Abrahamic religions, you know, suck for the environment. Yeah, we do. In general, we do. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that humans do. That's us projecting our nonsense onto the whole human race,
some
right?
kind of like original sin thing too.
It is. It is. You know, because Homo sapiens goes back at least 200,000 years, right? Maybe longer, right? And as for the genus Homo, that goes back 2 million, something like this, right?
I have those numbers in my head.
Yeah. So what we consider to be humans, by in a strict sense, goes back at least 200,000 years. In a more general sense, including Neanderthals and such, goes back much further than that. You know, right? Because we invented I believe we invented fire. We started dealing with fire before we were even Homo sapiens, I believe, right? So tool making and all that. So that all goes back a long ways to look at the behavior of one group of human beings, in the last 10,000 years, following a set of, bizarre religions that came out of the Middle East, less than 3,000 years ago, and saying that's what human beings are. It's like, that's ridiculous. Human beings are everything that we've done all the way back, and 90% of that was not this nonsense that's going on now, where we needed to be kept out of an area for fear of destroying it. Now, on a practical basis, does it make sense in the United States to keep most people out of these places? Well, of course it does.
In some ways, when the parks got shut down because of the government shutdown, people were mowing over Joshua trees.
Yeah.
It's like you have to protect the land from shitty people.
Yeah. Yeah. But then at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, but wait a minute. How about the people who weren't being shitty? How about the people who had a tradition of not being shitty and of being the opposite of that? And how about letting them be there? So the Park Service just finally passed this new rule a few years back to where they'll now consider letting Native American people come in and harvest.
I read that, and plant, but they still have all these conditions
and they're deciding.
Weird. They're weird.
They're deciding what will be acceptable.
When they're not even informed on what the wildtending practices are, or like in that area. I think I remember Nikki talking about, or maybe Finn speaking to, and Finn's someone that y'all are both
Phoenicia Madrano.
Acquaintances with. Just the lack of knowledge that often the Forest Service even has about what plants are even there, like the biscuit roots, for example, and how they have even had conversations with them in a way to try to like let them know, hey, you should acknowledge this plant too because it's a really important plant. And like, that how would they even know how to filter? I don't know. It's just such a different paradigm.
Yeah. No, they wouldn't.
And they're like clashing,
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see that, like, okay, that's a good step, I guess. It's at least acknowledging that you think that humans, these people should be able to come back here and do this, but it's still not acknowledging that they're an integral part of that landscape, that they should be a part of it all the time. There's still some that old world view of like protecting this wilderness for mostly white people to come and parade around in and view and experience and then go back to their suburbia. There's still a lot of that in there, and even just reading in your piece about how even sometimes the way that those lands are treated is to cater to the money that can be made from them, not the preservation of them.
Right.
So the ideal is being imposed on the land, influenced by capitalism as well.
Yep.
And now these private commissions companies are often running the national park services.
That's terrible.
That are also owned by prison company, private prison and companies.
I hadn't heard that connection.
Yeah, like the one in Yosemite, I can't remember the name of it right now. My ex-partner's family has a private in-holding in Yosemite, so I just learned about it. Like it's like from an old ranch and stuff. I don't know. It's a whole thing, but learning about like that kind of thing, that these private companies come in and run the commissary, but they're the same companies that own the private prison commissaries, like because a lot of prisons are privately managed. So it's like weird.
That sucks.
Kind of parallel going on there.
Yeah, because obviously the prison industrial complex just needs to be shut down.
Yeah.
That's not really a reformable institution. Yeah.
Yeah, the complexity of public land stuff too, and like just the way that Native folks have been screwed over and over. I really hope that shifts in some way in the future. I mean, it really depends on what happens in our political climate as well. We'll see, but
yeah.
Well, you're starting a podcast, and I don't know if this will be out before or after you first release a bunch of your episodes, but maybe you, like, as we kind of wrap this up, maybe you could give us an idea about what people can expect from your podcast.
Right. Well, there's going to be a podcast that's an interview show, and the working title of the interview show is Voices for Nature and Peace. So the focus will be on ecological issues and then issues of militarism and also justice. I mean, justice is something that can exist. Peace cannot exist without justice. To put it in those terms, right? So really, I can bring in almost anything under that heading,
Yeah.
which is really nice. Anything political or environmental or otherwise. And so I'll be putting that out on a YouTube channel at the same time that I'm posting it out as podcast on all the regular channels. So probably on the YouTube channel, I'll also be putting some other content in there as well. It would be really easy for me. I do a weekly column every week. I could very easily do a reading of each weekly column, put it up there. You know, I'm also interested in doing some book reviews and putting them up there. So hopefully it'll be not just the interview podcast, but some other content too. And then I'll be launching, at the same time, I'll be launching a Patreon page, you know, too, to see how much interest there is in supporting my work in that way.
Mm-hmm. You've interviewed some people in your books, and some of those folks you'll also be putting on the podcast as well, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back and re-interview them. That's really
cool.
Yeah, so I interviewed the activists from Basin and Range Watch and put that in one of the books. And they're folks who are in Nevada, and they're keeping an eye on the huge energy projects, the green energy projects that are going on there. And they're pointing out that, well, if you come in and put this giant solar project in here, you're wiping out that entire habitat, you're killing all the plants that live there, you're killing most of the animals who live there, you know. Then in some cases these power plants aren't even producing what they're supposed to produce. I mean, there's a big corporate boondoggle going on there, you know. So I interviewed them for a book. I just interviewed them again a couple days ago for the podcast, so I'll have them on. I mean, that's just that's a situation with the green energy, for example, where what we should be doing if we want to lessen our dependence on fossil fuel and all the pollution it creates is, first of all, use less. Not how can we replace fossil fuel use with solar and wind or whatever, but how can we use less, you know? Could we first of all use so much less collectively as a culture that we could just shut down a bunch of coal plants, you know, not replace coal plants, just shut down a bunch of coal plants, you know. That would be the first step, would be reduce, you know. There's this whole reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce is first, to reduce our footprint, you know. So that would include, for example, some sort of unsexy ideas like making all of the buildings more energy efficient, you know. I mean, how many houses don't have good insulation in them? You know, in the Pacific Northwest, that was like really common for houses not to have very good insulation in them. Even
so
though
to build reactions to how much energy is being used before actually reducing the energy, which we're going to have to do anyways,
right.
It's kind of a weird, pointless
let's reduce first and see how many solar panels we need to build, you know, because like in California right now, they've actually built out enough solar that during the peak parts of the day, the sunny parts of the day, they actually have to shut some of the solar down because it's putting too much power into the system. Well, okay, something's not working there, you know? I mean, something's, you know. So yeah, like insulate the houses better, put double pane windows on them, you know, like appliances need to be a lot more efficient than they are, you know. There's putting on a sweater, you know, there's all of that kind of thing needs to happen, you know, first, you know. And then we'll see, because of course if you build solar panels, you're digging up rare earth metals somewhere, you know, usually in a quote developing country, often involving labor abuses, sometimes involving child labor, sometimes involving slavery or near slavery, you know. That's where rare earth metals come from, you know, to build your solar panels. And then you're making these components that have a life of like 20 years, maybe 30, maybe 40, and then are they recyclable? Can they be recycled? Or is that just trash now? Are we, you know, like I saw an article the other day about how, you know, windmill turbine, the blades on those giant, you know, windmills that they have out there, currently those aren't being recycled and they're just piling up in landfills somewhere. Some of this is that those things could be recycled, but it's not profitable to do so. Well,
it's the profit piece. It's like
we've got to take the profit motive out of most aspects of society at this point, you know? Like the profit motive needs to be taken out of agriculture, it needs to be taken out of energy, it needs to be taken out of housing, anything that has to do with a basic human need should not have the profit motive involved at all. Should not have capitalism involved at all, in another way of putting it.
Even protecting land often has a profit aspect to it as well. Like it has to be
Yeah.
valued at a certain...
Yeah. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The profit motive doesn't, it doesn't work, Some of that's capitalism, some of that's pre-capitalism, I mean, we can get rid of capitalism, but we still would be stuck with other bad frames of mind and bad ways of looking at things and bad ways of looking, I mean, getting rid of capitalism would be an awesome first step, don't get me wrong, but that wouldn't be the end. We still need to go further than that, I mean, we can not be capitalists and still be abusing the land, I mean, it's true, we can, you can not be a capitalist and still clear cut a forest, I mean, so.
Yeah. I often just blame everything on capitalism. But it's so much more than that.
It's great that people are talking about capitalism. People were not how old are you? You're 20?
I'm 33.
33, right? Okay. I'm 50. And we were not talking about capitalism when I was 33, which would have been in the 90s. It never came up, except among, some like socialist freaks or whatever, right? I mean, like, it just doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, like we weren't, I guess I was 33 in the early 2000s. So people weren't, and I don't mean to insult socialists because like the permaculture people, they're very well-meaning and have their heart in the right place and they're trying to do things. But I'm glad that people are talking about capitalism now. But it's not the root problem. It's just one of the most problematic things that we're dealing with right now.
Do you feel like the root problem has to do with religion or something else?
Right. Well, the religion. Like the Abrahamic religions that we know so well, the Christianity, which came out of Judaism, and then Islam, they all came out of the Abrahamic tradition, right? They all have this view of the world that we have dominion over the planet, so we're able to do whatever we can or where we want to it. We've been given permission to do that. We own it, whatever, So those books that became the what we call the Old Testament, or what Christians call the Old Testament, that started getting written not that long ago, like 600 BC or so, when the Babylonians took over the area that's now Israel, and a lot of the Hebrews were brought into slavery in Babylon. At that time, trying to preserve their own culture in this foreign place, they started to write their stories down. They also adopted some stories from the Babylonians. They got the flood story from the Babylonians. I mean, as you know, lots of people all over the world have a flood story. Something obviously happened at some point, that everyone's talking about. Some of the creation stuff they got from the Babylonians too. So at that time, what they were doing was putting a religious framework onto a lot of ideas and practices that already existed. So people already were acting as if they had dominion over the earth, right? And had been for thousands of years at that point, right? Like, slavery existed at that point. Slavery at first, in parts of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, slaves were women, not men. That's interesting too. So women were enslaved by men in the household and in the culture, that happened all before those religions came in. So then the Abrahamic religions formed around that time, and they just sort of put their stamp of approval and sort of codified, all of it. So I would say that religion has been, the Abrahamic religions have been, Gore Vidal called them the monotheism, I think the greatest mistake humanity ever made, or something like that, right? And yeah, it's right up there,
I mean, I say religion, and it's such a broad thing to state,
right.
But we were just talking off air before this about just how we both aren't necessarily anti-religion or anti-Christian or whatever. We just it's way more nuanced, and every individual and every subgroup within all of it is more nuanced than just saying, well, religion's responsible for all our problems, or Abrahamic religions is the worst thing ever. It's what we have with it now. I mean, it has had a lot of negative influences, but there's a lot of people that have been doing other, it's just it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, the Abrahamic religions have been a horror show, but so is Hinduism, Hinduism's been bad, and the Chinese, culture, they were able to to have dominion over their landscapes, and
Buddhism too has had.
Yeah, exactly. Without benefit of either Hinduism or or the Abrahamic religions, they did it on their own. So yeah, I mean that's probably why I keep coming back to agriculture, because it comes before all those. And we can dig further back than agriculture. We can be like, oh, fire, things changed with fire, and they did. Ooh, things changed with language. So I'm not going to say that agriculture is the source either. Just that's a recent and obvious wrong turn that we took as a species, and it led us to this day. It has led to climate change and all the things that we're seeing now.
Wow, that's a good wrap all the way back around to the beginning of our conversation right there.
You're welcome.
Perfectly timed. Well, is there any last thoughts you have, and also how can people find you online? You have a couple different ways. But
Right. You can go to my blog, which is called maxkamoksha.com. That's MACSKAMOKSHA.com. And that's impossible to remember, so you'll write it down in the show notes. And and that's just put together from the Hungarian word for cat, maxka, and moksha, which is a Sanskrit word referring to liberation, sort of a spiritual liberation. Because I do have admiration for a lot of the Eastern ways of looking at things.
And we're surrounded by cats right now.
And I am a member of a cat worshiping cult. So absolutely, that's the best place to go. That's like, you go there and you can find anything else in there, like connections to me on Facebook and Instagram or any of those, Twitter, all that. I do all that stuff. So,
and maybe by the time this goes out, you'll have your podcast title and finalize and links to that and stuff like that, and I'll be able to put that in there as well. So. And then on your website, you also sell these books that we've been mentioning.
There's a bookshop on my website, and there's like 4 or 5 different books there that I've sold that you can buy. You can buy the hard copy forms of them, paperback, or you can get electronic forms for them for cheaper. And also in the next couple months, I'll be introducing audiobook forms of them too.
Sweet.
Where I'm going to do the narration myself.
You're going to read through the whole thing. Yeah.
I did a test read of a part of one the other day, and it was fun. I was like, okay, I can get into this. This will be fun.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
So people just want to listen while they drive or whatever, a garden.
Yeah. Audiobooks are really popular. I mean, I put it out there on social media. I'm like, how are people into audiobooks? Should I do that? And people are like, oh my gosh, yeah, please do that. Whoa. There was a very enthusiastic response. And I've been getting more into listening to podcasts and that kind of thing lately. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is nice. Like, I'm sitting down to do a sewing project. Oh, this is really nice to put on a podcast. Oh, I'm driving to town. It takes, almost an hour to get there. Oh, I'll put on Lee Camp's latest, podcast or whatever. So
now you have all this fancy podcast equipment.
Yeah, I've got a friend who's an audiophile who has nice equipment. He's lending it to me so I can try this out. So we'll see how it goes. And I'm grateful for that, because I wouldn't have been able to afford it myself. So.
Well, thanks for sitting down and chatting with me.
My pleasure, Kelly. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Yeah, thanks.
You just listened to a conversation with Kollibri terre Sonnenblume on the Ground Shots podcast. And here on our way out, I wanted to let you know that the music for this podcast was by Faye Petrie. Thank you, Faye, for letting me use your music. And the song was called Thank You for Treating Me Like a Melody Drawn in the Air. Such a beautiful song. I have Faye's Bandcamp linked in the show notes, so go over there and support their music and listen to more beautiful music there. Also, just a reminder that you can find anything related to Kollibri's work linked in the show notes here on the podcast, so go ahead and check that out. You can order his books and download the free zine, the invasive plant zine, or you can buy a hard copy as well that he has on his website and read any of his amazing articles he's written. And with that, thanks for listening, and until next time, y'all, take care. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com. to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.